When the man who saved your broken heart turns out to be your professor and your ex's father. Man, there is a moment when your entire world collapses. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once, like a chandelier falling from a cathedral ceiling. For Elena Rossi, that moment came at 23, dressed in silk the color of champagne, standing outside a bedroom door that should have been locked. What she saw inside didn't just break her heart. It destroyed the version of herself who still believed in fairy tales. But fate, cruel, twisted, magnificent fate, had already placed the man who would rebuild her in the very next room. She just didn't know yet that he would also become the most dangerous choice she'd ever make. If this story already has its hands around your heart, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one goes all the way. The evening that Elena Rossi's life split cleanly in two began the way all great disasters do, beautifully. The Valenti estate sat on the outskirts of Milan like something conjured from a dream that couldn't quite decide whether it was romantic or ominous. 3 stories of pale limestone rose against the October sky, every window lit from within, warm gold light spilling across manicured hedgerows and the long gravel driveway where valets in white gloves collected cars with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to expensive things. Ivy climbed the eastern wall in thick dark ropes. Fountains murmured in the courtyard. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were flowers. White roses arranged in towering vases that must have cost more than Elena's monthly rent. She had stood at the iron gate for a full 30 seconds before walking through it. You belong here, she had told herself. Adrian invited you. You are his girlfriend. You belong here. She had almost believed it. Elena Rossi was the kind of beautiful that people often overlooked in a room full of louder, more performative beauty. She had dark hair she usually wore pinned up because she was always late and never had time to style it properly, and brown eyes that her mother called ordinary and her art history professors called observant. She was not the kind of woman who walked into rooms and stopped conversations. She was the kind who slipped in quietly and noticed everything: the crack in the gilded frame, the forged signature on the lithograph, the way a smile didn't quite reach the eyes of the person wearing it. She had been noticing things about Adrian Valenti for 6 months. The way he laughed too loudly when he wanted people to look at him. The way he checked his phone during meals and then tucked it face down against his thigh when she glanced over. The way he introduced her to his friends as, "This is Elena," without the possessive, without my girlfriend, as though she were a piece of furniture he was still deciding whether to keep. But she had also noticed other things. The way he brought her coffee exactly how she liked it without being asked. The way he remembered that she hated horror films and always picked something else. The way he sometimes looked at her across a room with an expression that seemed genuinely like wonder. She had chosen to believe in the second set of things. That was the mistake. The party was enormous by any standard and grotesque by Elena's. There had to be 300 people spilling through the ground floor of the Valenti estate. Men in dinner jackets, women in gowns that cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe. A string quartet tucked into the corner of the main salon, playing something that no one was listening to. Waiters moved through the crowd like silverfish, bearing trays of champagne and tiny, architectural food that looked too beautiful to eat. Adrian's 30th birthday. Adrian's world. Elena had arrived with him, or rather, she had arrived in his car. There was a distinction, she realized now, a meaningful one. He had been on his phone the entire drive, one hand on the wheel, laughing at something she couldn't hear, angling the screen away from her when she looked over. She had stared out the window at the dark Lombardy countryside and told herself it was work. He was busy. Men like Adrian were always busy. For the first 2 hours, she played her role competently. She accepted champagne she didn't particularly want. She smiled at people whose names she immediately forgot. She admired the estate's art collection with genuine enthusiasm. There was a Modigliani in the second salon that made her breath catch. Elongated figures in ochre and rose, painted with such naked tenderness that it seemed almost indecent to display it at a party like this, among people who weren't really looking. She had stood in front of it for a long time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice had come from beside her. Low, a little rough, accented with the kind of Italian that belonged to someone who had grown up speaking it before they learned to perform it. She had turned, expecting another party guest, and found instead a man she didn't recognize standing slightly apart from the crowd, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, looking at the painting with an expression that matched her own. He was older. That was the first thing she registered. Not old, there was nothing diminished about him, but clearly north of 45, with silver threaded through dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that had been handsome once in a conventional way, and was now something more interesting, carved by time, and what looked like considerable experience into something harder and more compelling. He wore his dinner jacket the way men wore suits when they had stopped caring about being seen in them, correctly but without vanity, as though clothing was a language he spoke fluently but found slightly tedious. His eyes, when they moved from the painting to her face, were gray, not the theatrical romantic gray of fiction, a real, complicated gray, like sky before a storm that hasn't made up its mind. Modigliani understood something most portrait painters miss, Elena said, because she was an art history student and could not help herself. He wasn't painting what people looked like, he was painting what they felt like from the inside. The man looked back at the painting. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as though he was revising an assumption. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about that painting," he said. "And I've owned it for 11 years. She blinked. "You own this?" "I own the house," he said, as though this were a minor detail. "Victor Valenti." The name landed strangely. Valenti. Of course. She should have looked for a resemblance and she would have found it, not in coloring or feature, but in something architectural about the jaw, the set of the shoulders. Adrian's father. She had known, abstractly, that Adrian's father existed and that he was the source of the family's considerable fortune, but Adrian almost never mentioned him, and she had formed no particular mental image. She had certainly not formed this one. "Elena Rossi," she said. "I'm Adrian's girlfriend." Something crossed his face at that. A micro-expression, gone before she could classify it. He inclined his head slightly. "He has good taste," Victor Valenti said, and returned his attention to the painting, and that was the end of it. Or it should have been. Yeah, she found Adrian again near the bar around 9:30, flushed and laughing, surrounded by a group of men she vaguely recognized from the finance world he moved through. He kissed her cheek when she appeared. A performance of a kiss, lips barely grazing skin, already turning back to his conversation before she had fully registered his presence. "There's food in the east dining room," he said, not quite looking at her. "Go eat something. You must be starving." Go eat something, as though she were a child, as though she were a problem to be redirected. She had eaten something, and then she had wandered, because wandering was what Elena did when she felt invisible, and she felt very invisible tonight, moving through this glittering crowd of people who all seemed to know each other and speak a private language of references and names she had no key for. She had climbed the main staircase without exactly deciding to. The upper floors of the Valenti estate were quieter, carpeted in deep burgundy, lit by sconces that cast amber pools on pale walls. Family portraits ran along the corridor, generations of Valentis looking out from gilded frames with varying degrees of severity. Elena paused in front of them, unable to help herself, tracing the genetic thread backward through the faces. A young man who must have been Adrian's grandfather. A woman with magnificent cheekbones and an expression of magnificent contempt. And then, near the end of the corridor, a family photograph. Informal, obviously taken by someone who wasn't a professional. Slightly off-center, the light a little warm. Victor Valenti, younger by perhaps 15 years, with his arm around a woman who was laughing at something outside the frame. Between them, a boy of maybe 10 or 11 who had Adrian's coloring and was squinting into the sun. The woman was beautiful, and she was clearly gone. There was something in the way the photograph existed here, slightly hidden at the end of the corridor rather than displayed prominently, that suggested grief rather than preservation. Elena stood there longer than she should have. She had heard a sound. Not a party sound, not music or laughter or the clink of crystal. Something more contained. A voice, and then another voice, coming from behind the door at the end of the corridor, which was slightly ajar, light leaking through the gap in a thin gold line. Later, she would ask herself why she had moved toward it instead of away. She had no good answer. Perhaps it was the art historian's instinct, the compulsive need to look more closely, to understand what she was seeing. Perhaps it was something else, something prescient and terrible, some part of her that already knew. She had pushed the door open. The room was a guest bedroom, expensively furnished, a fire burning low in the grate. And on the bed, Elena's brain processed it in pieces, the way a body processes a physical blow. First impact, then pain, then the slow comprehension of the damage. Adrian, his hair disordered, his dinner jacket on the floor. And the woman with him was familiar in a specific, devastating way. The particular angle of her shoulder, the sound of her voice before it cut off sharply, the dark hair that was the same shade as Elena's own. Her sister, Marta, 25 years old. Elena's sister Marta, who had told her at dinner 3 weeks ago, over pasta their mother had made, that Adrian seemed lovely and Elena was so lucky. The world didn't spin. That's what people said. The world spins. Everything tilts. For Elena, it simply stopped, as though someone had cut the power, as though gravity briefly forgot its job. Elena! Adrian sat up, reaching for something to cover himself, his voice doing that thing it did when he was caught, flattening out, going professional, becoming the voice of a man who solved problems. This isn't... Listen, let me explain. Elena, please. Marta. Her sister's voice. The voice she had known since before she had words for anything. Elena didn't say a single thing. She turned around and she walked out of the room, and she pulled the door shut behind her with a quiet, precise click that felt, in retrospect, more final than any slam could have been. Maud. She didn't know how long she walked. The estate was larger than it appeared from outside. Corridors branching into corridors. Rooms leading to antechambers, leading to more rooms. The whole structure labyrinthine in the way of old Italian houses that had been added to over generations without any guiding architectural logic beyond accumulation. She found the east wing by accident. There was a door, heavier than the others, dark wood, no light visible beneath it. A brass plate at eye level read private, the kind of sign that assumed people would obey it. Elena pushed it open. The study beyond was nothing like the rest of the estate. Where the public rooms were furnished for impression, high ceilings, ornate plasterwork, everything selected to communicate wealth and taste, this room was furnished for use. Walls lined with actual books, not decorative spines. A desk with the comfortable disorder of a workspace that got worked in. A single lamp burning amber on a side table. 2 leather chairs facing a fireplace where a fire was burning itself down to coals. She made it as far as the nearer chair before her legs stopped cooperating. She sat. And then she wasn't sitting. She was hunched forward with her face in her hands. And the sound that came out of her was not a dignified sound. Nothing like the contained grief of films. It was ugly and jagged, and it came from somewhere so deep she hadn't known the place existed. She cried for what felt like a very long time. She didn't hear him come in. The East Wing is private. The voice, that voice, low and rough, and with that particular Italian cadence, came from behind her. Elena's head came up sharply. She turned in the chair. Victor Valenti stood in the doorway, still holding his untouched glass of whiskey, regarding her with an expression she couldn't parse. Not anger at the intrusion, not the performative concern of someone who felt obligated to help. Something more careful than either of those things. Watchful, as though he was trying to determine something. I know, Elena said. Her voice came out wrecked, hoarse and unsteady. She didn't try to disguise it. There wasn't much point. I'm sorry, I'll leave. She stood. The room tilted slightly. She had not eaten since that afternoon, and the champagne and the shock had conspired against her body's better judgment. Victor crossed the room in 4 long strides and caught her elbow before she listed sideways. His grip was firm. Not gentle, exactly. He wasn't a gentleman. She sensed that immediately. But steady, reliable. The grip of someone who was not going to let her fall. Sit down, he said. Not a suggestion. She sat. He released her elbow and moved to a cabinet against the wall, opening it to reveal, among other bottles, a decanter of something amber. He poured 2 glasses without asking her preference and set one on the table beside her. "Drink that." "I shouldn't. I've already had—" "It's not champagne. It's 30-year-old Scotch, and it will do what champagne couldn't." He settled into the chair across from her with the particular ease of a man who was very comfortable with silence. "Take your time." Elena looked at the glass. Then she picked it up and drank. The whiskey hit the back of her throat with a clean, fierce warmth that was nothing like the sweetness she'd been drinking all evening. It was the kind of drink that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She set the glass down, pressed her palms against her eyes. "Your son," she said. The words tasted like something spoiled. "Your son is upstairs with my sister." The silence that followed was not a surprise silence. "I see," said Victor Valenti. She looked at him. "You're not shocked." A long pause. He turned his whiskey glass once in his hand, a slow rotation, watching the light move through it. "Adrian has always been—" He stopped, reconsidered his words with the carefulness of someone who had learned that carelessness with language was expensive. "He has always chosen ease over discipline, in most aspects of his life." It was the most diplomatic demolition of his own son Elena had ever heard. "I loved him," she said. The past tense arrived without her consciously choosing it. "Or I thought I did. I think what I loved was the idea that someone like him could choose someone like me." She stopped. "That's a pathetic thing to say out loud." "It's an honest thing," Victor said. "Those are rarely the same." She looked at him properly for the first time since he'd entered the room. The firelight had gotten to him, softened the harder lines of his face, found warmth in the gray of his eyes. He was watching her with an attention that was different from the way people at the party had watched each other. Performative, calculating. He was simply paying attention, without an agenda she could detect. "Why aren't you angry?" she asked. "I broke into your private study." "You needed somewhere to be." A slight pause. "This room is good for that." She felt something give way in her chest. Not the grief. That was still there. Would be there for a long time, she knew. But something else. The particular tension of someone who has been bracing against a fall and suddenly realizes the floor is closer than they thought. "How long have you owned the Modigliani?" she asked, because talking about art was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else was in ruins. Something shifted in his face. "You want to talk about the painting?" "I want to talk about anything that isn't what just happened to me. Yes." He regarded her for a moment. Then slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "I bought it at auction in 2003, he said. "I knew nothing about art. I bid on it because a woman I was trying to impress told me Modigliani was significant, and then she left before the bidding closed, and I ended up with a €3 million painting and no one to explain it to me." Elena stared at him. "What did you do?" "I hung it in my study for 2 years and ate dinner looking at it every night and read everything I could find about the man who painted it." A pause. "By the end, I thought I understood it. By the year after that, I knew I didn't. Now I think understanding it was never the point." "That's—" Elena stopped. "That's actually a very sophisticated relationship with a piece of art. It's what happens when you spend enough time with something and stop trying to reduce it to a conclusion." The fire settled. Outside, dimly, she could still hear the party, music and laughter, and the murmur of 300 people who knew nothing about what had happened in the room above them, what was happening in this room. She looked at her hands. The ring Adrian had given her 2 months ago, not an engagement ring, he had been careful about that, a promise ring, he'd called it, sliding it onto her finger with a ceremony she'd read too much into, was still on her right hand. She took it off and set it on the table beside the whiskey glass. Victor looked at it, didn't comment. "I should go home," Elena said. "There are cars. I'll have someone drive you." "You don't have to—" "Elena." Her name in his mouth was a strange thing, careful, like he was pronouncing a word in a language he was learning. "I am not doing you a favor. I am correcting a situation that my son created in my house. There is a difference." She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. In the firelight, in the quiet of this private study full of books and the smell of old leather and wood smoke, something moved through her that she didn't have a name for yet. She filed it away. The way she filed away things she didn't yet understand about paintings, not to be resolved immediately, but to be returned to. She slept badly. Her apartment? A studio in the Navigli district, small and paint-stained and full of art books she'd stacked into makeshift furniture, felt both too familiar and too strange when she got back to it at close to midnight. The driver Victor had sent had been silent and efficient, and she had sat in the back of the dark car watching Milan's lights slide past the windows and felt entirely hollow. Her phone had 11 missed calls, 5 from Marta, 3 from Adrian, 2 from her mother, which meant Marta had already called their mother, which meant the version of events that had reached her mother was Marta's version, which meant Elena's grief was already being reframed into something more manageable for the people who had caused it. One call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't listen to the voicemail. She was exhausted and hollowed out, and the last thing she wanted was another voice laying something at her door. But she played it. "Miss Rossi?" The voice was Victor's. She recognized it instantly, that particular texture like gravel smoothed by a river. "I realize this may seem strange. You left something in my study. The ring is here when you want it, or don't want it. Either way, I hope you sleep." A pause. Then, "You were right about the Modigliani." She sat on the edge of her bed, holding her phone for a long time. Outside, Milan went on doing what Milan did. Beautiful and indifferent and ancient. A city built on layers of other cities, every stone placed on the ruins of something that came before. She did not sleep well. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, the hollow feeling in her chest shifted slightly. Not filled, nothing so simple as that, but differentiated, divided into something more complex than pure loss. She thought about gray eyes and firelight, about a man who had bought a €3 million painting because of a woman who'd already left and then spent 2 years eating dinner with it every night until he understood something true about it. "Stop trying to reduce it to a conclusion," he had said. She set her phone down, closed her eyes. Monday morning arrived the way Monday mornings always did, with an absolute indifference to what had happened over the weekend. Elena had 7.5 minutes to get from the tram stop to the lecture hall before her Art of the Italian Renaissance seminar started. She was going to be late regardless. She had decided, somewhere between her cold coffee and her inability to find her other boot, that she was going to be fine. She was 23 years old. She had survived worse than a faithless boyfriend, even if at this precise moment she couldn't immediately identify what that worse thing was. She had not returned Marta's calls. She had not returned Adrian's. She had texted her mother, "I'm fine. Not ready to talk. Please give me time." Her mother had responded, "Elena, be reasonable. These things happen in relationships." Marta is very upset. Elena had put her phone in her bag and not taken it out again. She was 3 minutes late to the lecture hall. The door was heavy oak, old and prone to creaking, and it creaked with theatrical commitment as she pushed it open and slid into the nearest available seat in the back row, dropping her bag under the chair and unzipping her coat and trying to reassemble herself into something that resembled a functioning graduate student. The room was a proper lecture hall, tiered seating, a wide floor at the bottom with a lectern and a projection screen, the particular smell of every academic building she had ever been in, old paper and radiator heat, and the specific anxiety of people trying to seem smarter than they felt. There was a man at the lectern. Elena was pulling her notebook out of her bag when she looked up. The notebook slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a flat crack that turned several heads. Victor Valenti stood at the lectern with a laser pointer in one hand and a calm that suggested he either had not yet seen her or had seen her and was handling it better than she was. He was dressed differently than Saturday night: dark trousers, a charcoal jacket, a shirt without a tie, the collar open at the throat, academic without trying. The silver in his hair caught the overhead light. On the projection screen behind him, Art History 401, Modern Italian Masters, Professor V. Valenti. He looked up from the papers on the lectern, surveying the room with the relaxed authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. His gaze found her. Elena watched the still of a man who had survived a great many unexpected things exercise itself in real time. 2 seconds. 3. His expression didn't change. That was the remarkable thing. A lesser person would have shown something. He simply held her gaze for one beat too long, neutral and steady, and then moved on, scanning the rest of the room with the same measured attention. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying easily to the back row without any particular effort. "For those I haven't met, I'm Victor Valenti. I'll be taking over this seminar from Professor Marchetti for the remainder of the semester." A murmur ran through the room. Elena gripped the edge of her desk. The remainder of the semester. 4 months, 16 weeks, 50-something lectures. She picked up her notebook from the floor, opened it to a clean page, wrote the date with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be. At the front of the room, Victor Valenti clicked to the first slide, a Modigliani portrait, one of the elongated figures in ochre and rose, a woman looking sideways out of the frame with an expression of absolute private knowledge, and began to speak. His voice was the same as it had been in the study, low, careful, choosing each word the way someone chooses footing in uncertain terrain. He said, "Modigliani was not painting what his subjects looked like. He was painting what they felt like from the inside." He did not look at her when he said it, but the words landed exactly where they were aimed. Yeah, she did not speak to him after class. She was the first one out of the room, moving fast, head down, coat already half on. She made it all the way to the courtyard before she stopped walking and stood in the pale October sunlight with her hands pressed flat against a cold stone wall and breathed. "Your professor," she thought. "Your ex-boyfriend's father is your professor." The universe, apparently, had opinions about her life. She was almost certain she could hear it laughing. She pushed off from the wall, straightened her coat, decided with the deliberate resolution of someone making a decision they are going to have to keep making every day, that she was a professional. She was a serious student. She was not going to be undone by the cosmic absurdity of this situation. She was going to be absolutely, perfectly fine. She almost believed it. Across the courtyard, a door opened. Victor Valenti stepped out, stopping immediately when he saw her, close enough now for her to see the slight tightening at the corner of his eyes that was the only indication he was not entirely composed. They looked at each other. "Professor Valenti," Elena said. Her voice was level. She was almost proud of it. "Miss Rossi," he said, the same careful pronunciation. A long beat. Students moved around them, oblivious, the courtyard busy with the ordinary traffic of university life. "This is an unusual situation," Victor said finally. "That's one word for it. I want you to know that what happened Saturday night doesn't exist in this context," Elena said, firmly, because she needed it to be firm. "It was an odd evening. We spoke for a short time. I'm your student. That's the relevant fact." He studied her. That gray, assessing gaze that she was already beginning to recognize. The look of a man who is used to evaluating situations for their actual content rather than their surface presentation. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Neither of them moved for 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded, a small, professional nod, and walked away across the courtyard without looking back. Behind her, she heard nothing. He didn't call after her. He didn't make it complicated. She turned the corner and leaned against the wall and let out a breath that had been building since Saturday night and stood there for a moment in the autumn light, listening to the city moving around her. The bells of some far church, the tram on the street beyond the gates, the sounds of a world that was continuing without any particular regard for the state of her heart. "Fine," she thought, "we can do this." She was 23 years old. She had absolutely no idea what she was walking toward. But then, that had always been the condition of beginning. You never did. 3 weeks passed. Elena counted them the way she counted everything she was trying not to think about, by noticing, involuntarily, each time the relevant thing came back into her peripheral vision. A Monday, a Wednesday, a Friday. The seminar met 3 times a week, 50 minutes each session, and Elena sat in the 3rd row from the back because the back row had felt too obvious, and the front row was unthinkable, and she took notes with the focused intensity of someone using academic diligence as a form of self-defense. Victor Valenti was an extraordinary lecturer. She had not expected that. She had expected competence. He was clearly an educated man, clearly someone who knew the subject, but competence was different from what he actually was in front of a room. He didn't perform. That was the thing that separated him from every other professor she'd sat under. He didn't adopt the slightly theatrical register that academics often slipped into when they had an audience, that particular elevation of diction that signaled "I am now professing." He simply spoke, as that low, deliberate voice, as though he were thinking through the material in real time and inviting the room to think alongside him. He asked questions he didn't immediately answer. He sat with ambiguity in a way that made the students in the room sit with it too, leaning forward slightly, waiting. He never called on Elena. She noticed this. She told herself it was professional consideration. He was managing the obvious awkwardness of the situation with discretion, and she told herself this was the correct interpretation, and she mostly believed it. But there was something in the deliberateness of his non-attention that felt, paradoxically, like a form of attention. Like the way you can feel someone in a room not looking at you with more intensity than if they were. She was an art historian. She understood negative space. Outside of the lecture hall, she rebuilt herself with the methodical determination of someone who has decided that falling apart is not a luxury they can afford. She did not speak to Marta. Not yet. Not when the wound was still fresh enough that she didn't trust what she would say. She had one brief catastrophic phone call with her mother that ended with her mother saying, "Elena, at your age, I had already been married 2 years. These things require compromise." And Elena setting the phone down on the kitchen counter and leaving the room. She did not return Adrian's calls. He sent 3 texts in the first week. The first defensive, the second apologetic, the third, inexplicably, accusatory, as though the real problem here was her unwillingness to have a mature adult conversation about what had happened. She read all 3 and responded to none of them, and felt, with each passing day, the particular relief of silence. She threw herself into work. She was writing her thesis on the influence of African sculpture on early Italian modernism, a topic her previous advisor had described as ambitious, perhaps overly so, in a tone that suggested he meant unlikely to succeed. She decided, in the aftermath of the party, that unlikely to succeed was her favorite kind of project. She was in the university library on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the semester had restarted, surrounded by a fortress of monographs and her third coffee of the day, when she heard the door open behind her. She knew, before she looked up, who it was. She couldn't have explained how. Something about the quality of the silence that came in with him. The particular way the air in a room reorganized itself around Victor Valenti's presence. He stopped when he saw her, just briefly, that half-second recalibration she was learning to recognize. "Miss Rossi." "Professor." She kept her eyes on her book. "The periodicals section is to the left." A pause. "I'm aware of the library's layout. I've used it for 15 years. Then you don't need directions." Another pause, longer this time. She turned a page she hadn't actually read. "What are you working on?" he asked, and his voice had shifted fractionally, less formal, the professional register dropping just slightly, the way a temperature drops at the end of an afternoon. She looked up despite herself. He was standing at the end of her table, holding a folder of papers, regarding her thesis notes with what looked like genuine curiosity. "African formalism and the Italian moderns," she said, "specifically the influence on Modigliani's portrait methodology. The received wisdom is that his elongation came from medieval painting. I think that's incomplete." Victor set his folder down on the opposite end of the table. "What do you think it came from?" "Fang masks, coda reliquary figures. The geometric reduction of the human face to its essential emotional architecture, rather than its anatomical detail." She stopped. "You can sit down if you want to disagree with me. I've been developing this argument for 6 months and I'm fairly committed to it." Something happened in his face that she was beginning to identify as the Victor Valenti equivalent of amusement, a slight increase in stillness, a fractional softening around the eyes that in a more expressive person would have been a full smile. He sat down. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She spread out her photographs, the fang masks alongside the Modigliani portraits, the shared angles, the same radical simplification of feature that communicated more emotional complexity than any anatomically accurate face could. And she walked him through her argument with the focused passion of someone who has been thinking about something for so long they've forgotten it might sound eccentric to others. He listened the way he lectured, completely, without the performance of listening. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both the kind that exposed the load-bearing assumptions in her argument rather than attacking the surface. Your weakest point, he said when she finished, is the timeline. You need documentation that places Modigliani in direct contact with African art in Paris before 1908. Without that, the parallel is suggestive but not evidential. I know, Elena said. I'm working on it. There are letters. I just haven't been able to access the archive that holds them. Which archive? She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I know the director. I can make a call if you want access. She looked at him across the table, across the spread of photographs and monographs, in the quiet of the library with its smell of old paper and its warm yellow lamplight. Why would you do that? She asked. He met her gaze without deflecting. Because the argument is worth making if the evidence is there. A pause. That's the only reason. She held his eyes for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she nodded. Thank you, she said. They sat in silence for a while after that, each with their own work, the library moving quietly around them. It should have been awkward. It was instead something she didn't have a word for. Comfortable was wrong, too domestic and soft. But there was an ease to it, a naturalness, as though this particular configuration of people and space and lamplight had always existed and they were only now arriving at it. She left first, at 9 o'clock, with a quiet good night that he returned in the same register. On the tram home, she told herself very firmly that what she was feeling was nothing more than gratitude and the residual warmth of a good academic conversation. She was not entirely convinced. The archive access came through 4 days later. An email from the director, formal and courteous, offering her a 2-week appointment the following month. She stared at it for a long time. Then she sent Victor a 1-line email. The archive replied, "Thank you." His response came 4 hours later, equally brief. "Let me know what you find." She read it 3 times and then closed her laptop and went for a walk along the Naviglio Grande in the cold November air, watching the water move in the last of the afternoon light, and had a very honest conversation with herself about what was happening. Something was happening. That was the honest part. Not something she had chosen or planned or could easily categorize, but something real and specific, growing in the space between 2 people who kept finding each other in rooms and discovering, to their mutual inconvenience, that they did not want to stop talking. He was 50 years old. She was 23. He was her professor. He was her ex-boyfriend's father. She listed these facts the way you list the reasons not to look over the edge of a great height. They were real facts. They were significant facts. They were also somehow failing to function as deterrents in the way that facts were supposed to. She went home and made pasta and graded herself sternly on the multiple categories in which the situation was impossible, and went to bed, and dreamed about a Modigliani painting where the woman looking out of the frame had gray eyes. November deepened. The lectures continued. The library became, through a process of natural selection that neither of them exactly orchestrated, a place they both worked on Thursday evenings. It began with accident and continued with what could, if you were being uncharitable, be called plausible deniability. He was a professor who used the library. She was a student who used the library. That they consistently used it at the same time, at the same pair of tables in the East Reading Room, was a coincidence that neither of them examined too closely. They talked about art. They talked about it the way people talk when a subject is both genuinely important to them and also the only safe territory in a landscape full of things they can't say. Modigliani gave way to De Chirico, to the metaphysical vacancy of his painted squares and towers, the shadows that fell in the wrong direction. From De Chirico they moved to Fontana, the slashed canvases, the violence beneath the elegance. And Victor said something about Fontana that stopped Elena mid-sentence. He wasn't destroying the canvas, Victor said. He was trying to get to what was on the other side of it. She looked at him. You've thought about this seriously. I spent 20 years in a world where the surface of things was all that mattered. You think about what's underneath. He said it simply, as a plain fact, and then returned his attention to his papers in a way that suggested he hadn't meant to say quite that much. Elena filed it carefully. The way she filed everything he let slip. The small excavations, the glimpses of something below the composed, controlled exterior. What world was that? She asked. He looked up, held her gaze. Not one I'm ready to talk about in a university library. Fair enough, she said, and returned to her own work, and did not push. But the sentence stayed with her. A world where the surface of things was all that mattered. It suggested a specific kind of education, a specific kind of cost. The tension between them was not a comfortable thing. She wanted to be clear about that. It was not the easy, enjoyable tension of a simple attraction. It was taut and complicated and frequently inconvenient, the kind of thing that made the air in a room feel pressurized, that made ordinary sentences carry too much weight. She would catch herself parsing his words for meaning that shouldn't be there. She would notice, in the middle of a lecture, the particular way he held a piece of chalk, and have to redirect herself back to her notes with an internal sternness she found increasingly exhausting. She was not naive. She knew what this was. She had sat through enough lectures on Dante to understand the particular torment of wanting something that every reasonable parameter of your life said you should not want. She also understood, from the same lectures, how rarely reasonable parameters won. It was in the 4th week of November, on a Wednesday afternoon, when the situation broke open. The seminar had been running long. They were deep in a discussion of Kara's war paintings, the way trauma restructured vision, how the futurist celebration of violence had curdled into something more complicated in the years after the First World War. Victor had been standing at the front of the room without the lectern between him and the class, just standing, hands in his pockets, talking, and the class had been more alive than usual. 15 students actually arguing, actually invested. Elena had asked a question about moral accountability, whether an artist who celebrated violence was responsible for the violence that followed, or whether art existed in a space beyond causality. And Victor had stopped and looked at her in a way that was different from the way he looked at anyone else in the room, more direct, more personal, as though the question had landed somewhere specific in him. "That's the question that doesn't have a clean answer," he said. "And I'd argue that anyone who gives you a clean answer to it hasn't actually thought it through." "What's your answer?" she pressed. The other students were watching. She was aware of that. She pressed anyway. A long pause. "I think people are responsible for what they choose to celebrate," he said. "And I think there are forms of enthusiasm that we spend years believing are innocent and then discover at some cost are not." The room was very quiet. "At what kind of cost?" Elena asked. Victor looked at her. Something moved in his gray eyes, old and specific and not for public consumption. "The kind you don't recover from easily," he said. "The kind that changes what you see when you look in the mirror." He moved on. He returned to Kara. The seminar continued and closed, and the students filed out, and Elena sat for a moment longer than necessary, gathering her things, and when she looked up, she and Victor were alone in the room. He was erasing the board, his back to her. "I apologize," he said, without turning around. "That was too personal for a seminar." "It was honest," she said. "I asked an honest question." He turned then, chalk dust on his hands, regarding her across the empty room. "You have a way of doing that," he said. "Asking the question that goes directly to the thing you're not supposed to touch." "I'm an art historian. It's professionally required." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light through the tall windows was the low, amber light of November, the kind that makes everything look like it's being seen through water. "Elena," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name since the study, without the Miss Rossi. Just her name, and in his mouth it had the same quality it had had that night, careful, weighted, like something he'd considered before saying. "Victor," she said. An equal weight, an equal consideration. The space between them was about 15 feet of lecture hall. It felt simultaneously like a very manageable distance and an impossible one. "This is a situation that requires us both to exercise considerable judgment," he said, and his voice was doing something she'd never heard in it, a roughness beneath the control, a pressure building against the composure. "I know," she said. "You are my student. I know that too. And you are 23 years old. I'm aware of how old I am." A pause. "I am 50. I can do the math." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the precise diction of a man choosing every word as though it might be used against him, "I am not unaware of what is happening between us. I want you to know that I'm aware of it and that I am choosing, consciously and deliberately, to maintain appropriate... Victor. She stopped him, not unkindly. I know, I'm choosing the same thing, consciously and deliberately. A beat. I just wanted you to know that I know what it is, that I'm not confused about it or reading into nothing. I see it clearly. He looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, something stripped of its professional composure, for just a moment, something that was simply a man who was feeling something he had not anticipated and did not entirely know what to do with. All right, he said finally, we see it clearly. And we make the appropriate choices, she said. Yes. She picked up her bag, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. For what it's worth, she said, not turning around, I think the answer to the question is yes. We are responsible for what we choose to celebrate, and I think knowing that is the beginning of something better, not the end of something good. She left without looking back. Behind her, the empty lecture hall held the November light and the silence of a decision that both of them were still, stubbornly and magnificently trying to make the right way. December arrived with cold that had teeth and a faculty end-of-semester reception that Elena did not intend to attend, and attended anyway because her thesis advisor pressed a glass of wine into her hand at 4 p.m. and told her it was mandatory for graduate students. The reception was in the university's formal hall. High coffered ceilings, faculty in clusters, the kind of institutional socializing that operated on its own laws of physics, people attracted and repelled by professional gravity. Elena wore a dark green dress she'd owned for 2 years and stood near the drinks table and talked to 2 other graduate students about the archive access problem and felt, overall, that she was handling herself with reasonable dignity. She saw Victor across the room about 20 minutes in. He was with a group of senior faculty, listening more than talking, a glass of wine in his hand that he appeared to be drinking as slowly as the whiskey at the estate. He was in a dark suit, no tie again, that particular way of being formally dressed without appearing to care about it. He looked like himself, which was to say, he looked like no one else in the room, a fact that Elena registered with an irritation she directed entirely at herself. He glanced over, found her, held the look for exactly the length of time that could be classified as collegial acknowledgement, and then returned his attention to his conversation. She told herself this was exactly right, and felt it was exactly wrong in a way she was becoming very tired of cataloging. She was talking to her advisor, Professor De Luca, a small, rumpled woman in her 60s who had published 12 books on futurism and had opinions about everything, when the older woman leaned in with the conspiratorial candor of someone who has stopped pretending professional social events are professional. How are you finding Valenti's seminar? De Luca asked. Excellent, Elena said carefully. He's a rigorous thinker. De Luca sipped her wine. He's an interesting choice for the position. Lots of money, obviously. The man endowed 3 of our library's reading rooms, which is why he's allowed to walk in here and teach a seminar on the strength of a significant private collection and a reputation built entirely outside academia. A pause. Not that the private collection isn't remarkable, or the reputation. He's just not what we usually bring in. What kind of reputation? Elena asked, keeping her voice neutral. De Luca looked at her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had been in academia long enough to know when a question was more interested than it appeared. The kind built in rooms where people like me don't have memberships, she said mildly. Very powerful once, somewhat reduced now, apparently. Something happened some years ago. He's been more legitimate since. She set down her wine. You seem interested. He's my seminar professor, Elena said. I'm always interested in context. De Luca smiled, a small, private smile that said she had heard this particular tone before and knew exactly what it meant. She didn't pursue it. She was, Elena reflected, a remarkably astute woman. The reception wore on. Elena was circling the edge of the room, preparing to leave, when she turned a corner around a cluster of physics faculty and came face to face with Victor. They both stopped. Miss Rossi, he said. Professor Valenti. A pause. Are you enjoying the reception? I find these events useful in approximately the way surgical waiting rooms are useful, he said. Necessary, but not something you choose for pleasure. She laughed. Actually laughed, genuinely, before she could decide not to. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and she watched him register it with that particular stillness that meant something was happening behind the composed exterior. "That's a very specific analogy," she said. "I've spent time in surgical waiting rooms." He said it lightly, but there was weight under it, the kind of weight that meant real experience. They stood together for a moment, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of people, the ambient noise of the reception providing its own kind of privacy. "DeLuca tells me you endowed 3 reading rooms," Elena said. "2 reading rooms and a conservation lab," he said. "She's underinformed." "Why?" He looked at her sideways. "Philanthropy? Guilt? The fact that I have more money than I know what to do with in university libraries are one of the few things I find straightforwardly good." A slight pause. "All 3 probably, in varying proportions." "Guilt about what?" she asked. He turned to face her more directly. Around them, faculty laughed and clinked glasses and discussed semester grades. In their small pocket of the room, the air had the same pressurized quality it always acquired when they were close enough to have a real conversation. "About the years I spent being someone I don't particularly admire in retrospect," he said, quietly. "Precisely." "What kind of someone?" A long look. "Elena, you ask questions as though the answers won't have consequences." She met his gaze steadily. "I ask them because I want the answers, whatever they come with." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him making a calculation, not a dishonest one, not the calculation of someone deciding how to manage her, but the calculation of someone deciding how much truth was safe to give in a room full of colleagues. "Not here," he said finally. 2 words. They landed with the weight of a conditional promise. Not ever, but not here, not now, not like this. A door left open, not shut. She nodded. "Not here," she agreed, and that was its own kind of answer. The acknowledgement that there would be a here and a not here, a place where the conversation was different, where the professional architecture fell away, and something more honest was possible. She left the reception at 8 o'clock, walking out into the December cold with her coat pulled tight and her breath fogging in the lamplight, and she stood on the steps of the formal hall and looked out at the university courtyard, its flagstones dark with cold, and felt the peculiar vertigo of standing at the edge of something large. She thought about very powerful once, and something happened some years ago, in a world where the surface of things was all that mattered, and the way he'd looked when he said "not here," direct and unguarded, and carrying the particular weight of a man who had things to say that he had not yet said to anyone. She walked home through the cold city, past the lit windows of restaurants and the dark water of the canals, and she thought about what it meant to want something that required courage, not recklessness. She was clear about the difference, had always been clear about the difference. Courage. The particular courage of choosing to look at something directly instead of away. It was the last Thursday before the winter break, the library quiet in the way it got when the semester wound down and students disappeared homeward, when everything finally broke open between them. She had been there since 6. He arrived at 7:30. He sat at the other end of the table, opened his laptop, and worked in silence, and for 45 minutes the only sounds were the library's quiet breath and the occasional turn of a page. Then he said, without looking up, "Tell me something true." She looked up from her notes. He was looking at his laptop screen, not at her. "About what?" she said. "Anything." A pause. "Tell me something you haven't said to anyone else." She was quiet for a moment. The library settled around them. "I'm not over what happened at your house," she said. "Not Adrian specifically. I think I was already losing faith in that before I found out. But the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people, of being the person that nobody really looks at. I felt that my whole life, and I thought maybe, with him, it was different. And it wasn't." A pause. "That's harder than the betrayal." He was quiet. Then he closed his laptop. "You are not invisible," he said. He turned to look at her then, directly, without the professional remove, without any of the careful management she had watched him exercise for weeks, just looking at her. "You are the most present person in any room you enter. The problem is that most people are not paying enough attention to see it." The words fell into the library's silence and stayed there. "Victor," she said. "I know," he said. "We said. I know what we said." He held her gaze. "I'm not saying anything other than the truth. You asked for something true. That's what's true. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the quiet, with the weight of 6 weeks of deliberate restraint on both sides, and felt something that had been held under pressure for a very long time begin, inevitably, to surface. "The truth is that I think about you constantly," she said, each word chosen, each one placed carefully. "I think about our conversations, and I think about what you don't say. And I think about what you said about the Modigliani the first night, and I think about the fact that none of the ways this could go are straightforward, and I think about it anyway." A breath. "That's my truth." The silence after it was enormous. Victor Valenti set his pen down on the table. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "Elena," he said, and this time her name in his mouth was not careful at all. It was something entirely unguarded, the name said by someone who had been holding it in for a long time and had finally, simply, let it go. "I have spent 6 weeks being the most professionally appropriate version of myself I have ever managed, and I am telling you now, honestly, that it has been the most difficult 6 weeks I have had in a very long time, and I have had some difficult periods in my life." She felt herself smile. It surprised her. "That's saying something." "It is," he agreed. And then with the precision of a man making a decision, he has thought through and is making anyway with full knowledge of its weight. "I don't know what any of this is. I don't know what it can be within the obvious constraints. But I know that what I feel when I'm in a room with you is something I haven't felt in a very long time. And I am 50 years old, and I have earned the right, I think, to be honest about that instead of managing it until it goes away." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something seismic. "What do you feel?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Alive," he said simply. "I feel genuinely alive." And I had started to think that was something that happened to younger men. The word younger sat between them, not as a barrier but as an acknowledgement. He was naming the thing, not pretending it wasn't there. "Younger is relative," she said. "It is," he agreed, "but it's not irrelevant." "No," she said, "it's not irrelevant. Neither is the rest of it. The professorship, Adrian, all of it." She paused. "And none of it changes what's actually true." "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment, not resolved, not simple, but honest. The complicated truth laid out between them on the library table alongside the art books and the thesis notes, examined without flinching. "So," Elena said. "So," he said. "We're in significant trouble," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "We are," he agreed. "We are in very significant trouble." And somehow, in the warmth of that small shared acknowledgement, the absurdity and the weight and the impossible realness of it, Elena felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since October. Not resolution, not answers, just the relief of two people finally saying the true thing to each other across the small charged distance of a library table. Outside, December settled over Milan like a held breath, cold and clear and full of the particular silence of a city waiting for what came next. Inside, neither of them moved to leave. The winter break lasted 3 weeks, and Elena spent most of it in the archive. The director, a soft-spoken man in his 70s named Bianchi, who wore the same brown cardigan every day and moved through his domain with the proprietary tenderness of a man who had given his life to other people's letters, had given her a corner table near the window, good north light, and unrestricted access to the Modigliani correspondence files. She came every morning at 8 and left when the light failed, and in between she sat with the handwritten letters of a dead painter and felt, for the first time in months, the specific piece of work that mattered. She found what she was looking for on the 9th day. A letter dated March 1907, written in Modigliani's cramped, energetic hand to a sculptor friend in Paris. 4 pages, the ink faded to brown at the edges, describing an evening spent in the studio of a collector who had recently returned from West Africa with a collection of ceremonial masks. The letter was full of the young painter's characteristic intensity, the breathless, slightly grandiose enthusiasm of a 23-year-old who has just seen something that has reorganized his understanding of what a face could do. "They do not paint the face they see," Modigliani had written. "They paint the face that the spirit wears. And that face is always longer, always more stripped of accident, always more essentially itself than anything I have managed. I will not sleep until I understand this. Elena sat with the letter for a long time. Then she photographed it carefully and sat some more. She thought about Victor saying they do not paint what they look like. They paint what they feel like from the inside. She thought about the fact that he had arrived at the same understanding through a decade of eating dinner with a painting he hadn't planned to buy. She took out her phone and sent him a message. Their first communication since the library, since the words laid out on the table between them like a carefully arranged still life. She sent a photograph of the letter and beneath it wrote, "I found it." March 1907, he saw the masks and couldn't sleep. His response came 40 minutes later. That changes the argument from suggestive to evidential. Congratulations. Now you can actually sleep. She smiled at her phone in the archive's quiet, the way you smile at something when no one is watching, fully, without management. "I'll sleep when the chapter's done," she wrote back. "That sounds like something someone says when they intend not to sleep. You're very perceptive for a man who claims not to understand art." A pause. Then, "I never claimed that. I claimed I didn't understand it immediately. There's a difference." She set her phone face down on the table and looked at the letter and the winter light and let herself feel, without qualification, the simple warmth of being known. January returned them both to the university and to the rules they had established and agreed upon and were finding, with increasing difficulty, to maintain. The relationship, if that word could yet be applied to something so carefully unconsummated, existed in a specific geography, the library on Thursday evenings, where they worked alongside each other and talked about art and other things. Occasional messages. The seminar 3 times a week, where he did not call on her and she raised her hand anyway, because she was not going to diminish herself academically for the sake of appearances, and where their arguments were the best arguments in the room. A coffee, once, at a small place near the university that neither of them had planned. They had simply arrived at the same door from different directions and stood there on the January pavement looking at each other until Victor pulled the door open and they went in. That coffee lasted 2 hours. They talked about his late wife. Her name had been Lucia. She had died of an illness when Adrian was 14, and Victor spoke of her with a grief that had clearly been so long processed it had become part of the structure of him, load-bearing rather than raw. He spoke of her carefully, honestly, without the performance of either sentiment or stoicism. "She would have found you extraordinary," he said. He said it simply, as a fact, not as a compliment or a maneuver. "What was she like?" Elena asked. "Difficult," he said, without hesitation. Absolutely sure of herself in a way that didn't leave much room for doubt. She believed things completely. A pause. "I admired that. I also found it lonely sometimes. Being with someone who is entirely certain leaves you somewhat alone with your own uncertainty." Elena looked at him across the small table, the coffee cups between them, the January street moving past the window. "What are you uncertain about?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Currently, very little," he said, which is its own kind of problem. She understood what he meant. The certainty of what they felt was not the problem. The problem was everything surrounding it. The age, the position, the history, the world that would have opinions. The certainty lived at the center of a complicated situation, and the situation did not care about the certainty. "Tell me about the empire," she said. The word sat there. She had chosen it deliberately, not business or work. The word that De Luca's careful circumlocutions had pointed toward. Victor was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "My family had connections," he said, going back further than I could trace clearly. By the time I inherited those connections, they were significant. I was 28, and I believed I could manage them, keep the beneficial parts and reduce the rest. A long pause. "That is not how those things work." "What happened?" "Many things. Over many years." He looked at the window. "People were hurt. Some of them because of direct decisions I made. Some because of the environment I chose to operate in and refused to acknowledge the full cost of." He turned back to her. "I am not going to minimize that. It would be easy to say I was young or that I was operating within a system I didn't build, and both of those things would be true and also completely insufficient as explanations." Elena watched him. There was something in his directness, the refusal to soften it or make it palatable, that she found more moving than any justification could have been. "What changed?" she asked. "Lucia got sick," he said, "while I was managing my empire. While I was in rooms she didn't know about, making decisions she would not have sanctioned. She got sick, and I was not there for 6 weeks because I couldn't extricate myself from something that seemed, at the time, more urgent than my wife." A pause, long enough to be honest. She recovered, but I understood, in those 6 weeks, what I had chosen. What I had actually chosen in the real accounting of it, and I began, slowly, to choose differently. The cafe moved around them. Someone at the next table laughed at something on their phone. The ordinary world, continuing. "And the enemies you made along the way?" Elena asked. His eyes sharpened slightly. "Still there," he said. "That's the thing about those worlds. You can leave. The world doesn't leave you necessarily. There are people who have long memories and longer grudges, and no particular interest in the new version of you." He paused. "I manage the risk, but it doesn't disappear." She sat with this. Let it be real and heavy and specific, rather than reducing it to a story beat. "Are you in danger now?" she asked. "Less than I was," he said. "More than I'd like to be." "Is anyone around you in danger?" He looked at her very steadily. "I am careful," he said, "specifically to ensure that the answer to that question is no." She held his gaze. "I'm asking because it affects me," she said, "not because I'm afraid. There's a difference." He studied her for a long moment. "You are 23 years old," he said, not for the first time, and this time she heard what was underneath it. Not condescension, but fear. The particular fear of a man who had already lost people to his choices and was looking at someone new and calculating the cost. "I know how old I am," she said, "and I know what you're doing. You're building the case against yourself. You've been building it since October." "Someone has to." "You're also the only one building it," she said, "and I think you should let me have a vote." The sentence landed. He looked at her, and for a moment the composed, managed exterior was simply gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, just absent, leaving behind the face of a man who was 50 years old and had been alone, in the specific way that people in complicated lives are alone for a very long time. "Elena," he said. "Victor," she said. And that was where they left it, that afternoon in January, with the cold street outside and the coffee gone cold between them, and everything still unresolved, and somehow, despite that, more honestly itself than anything that had come before. The photographs appeared online on a Tuesday morning in the middle of February. Elena found out the way most people find out about their own disasters in the modern era, from her phone at 7:15 in the morning, still in the blue light of early waking, when a message from a classmate appeared. "Elena, there are photos. I'm so sorry." She clicked the link. Someone had been watching, or several someones. It was hard to tell from the sequence of images how coordinated it had been, whether this was one person's systematic surveillance or the aggregated attention of several people whose suspicions had aligned. The photographs were taken at different times, different locations. The library, the street outside the cafe, the university courtyard that morning in October when they had stood facing each other, and the whole transaction of Miss Rossi/Professor Valenti had been accomplished in full view of anyone paying attention. In themselves, the photographs showed nothing explicit. Two people in conversation, proximity. The particular way two people stand when they are aware of each other. But the photographs were accompanied by text, posted on 3 different platforms simultaneously, which suggested coordination, and the text was not interested in ambiguity. University professor and student in secret relationship. Victor Valenti, 50, and Elena Rossi, 23. See thread for full story. By the time Elena had read the post twice, it had been shared 47 times. By the time she reached the university, it was 200. She walked into the building with her head up and her coat buttoned and her face doing the thing she had been practicing since October. Neutral, composed, giving nothing away, and she made it all the way to the graduate student office before her hands started shaking. Her phone was ringing. Her mother. She declined it. It rang again. Marta. Of course, Marta, who had clearly seen the posts and was calculating what they meant for the family's various narratives. She declined that too. Adrian called twice before she turned her phone to silent and put it in her bag. The graduate office was empty when she arrived. She sat in her usual chair and opened her laptop and stared at the screen without seeing it, and worked on being the kind of person who could handle this, which required her to first locate that person, who felt somewhat theoretical at the moment. Professor De Luca appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, wearing her brown coat and an expression that combined concern with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen several academic scandals over a 40-year career and was not inclined to catastrophize. "Elena," she said, "come to my office." De Luca's office was small and overwhelming. Books on every surface, journals in teetering columns, a window looking out on the courtyard where pigeons moved with dreary persistence across the flagstones. She cleared a chair for Elena and sat behind her desk and poured 2 small glasses of something that turned out to be grappa at 8 in the morning, which Elena decided was exactly correct. "Tell me what's true and what isn't," De Luca said. Elena looked at her advisor, measured her. "We haven't done anything that violates university policy," she said. "We've had conversations. In the library and public, we've never—" She stopped. "Nothing has happened." "But something is happening," De Luca said. "Not an accusation. An observation made in the same tone she brought to art historical analysis." "Something is happening," Elena confirmed, "that we have both been very consciously managing." De Luca picked up her grappa. "The university will conduct a review," she said. "It's automatic when allegations involve a professor and a current student, regardless of what has or hasn't technically occurred. Victor will likely be asked to step back from the seminar pending review." The word Victor in De Luca's mouth landed strangely. Elena had grown used to thinking of him by name. Hearing someone else use it reminded her that he existed outside of her experience of him. "Will he lose his position?" she asked. "That depends on what the review finds and how the situation is managed." De Luca paused. "Elena, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you want me to help you distance yourself from this? There are ways to frame what's happened that would protect your academic standing and your thesis access. You could credibly present yourself as a student who was pursued in a situation of unequal power." The silence after the question was absolute. "No," Elena said. De Luca looked at her. "That's not what happened," Elena said, "and I'm not going to say it was." She set down the grappa glass. "Whatever the consequences are, I'm not going to make myself into a victim to avoid them. That's not what's true." De Luca studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "All right," in the tone of someone who had expected this answer and was, in some private part of themselves, glad of it. "You should know," De Luca said, more carefully, "that the people who posted those photographs, someone went to some trouble. This wasn't a random classmate with a phone. There's coordination here, and a specific interest in damaging Valenti's reputation." A pause. "I would think carefully about who might benefit from that." Elena went still. She thought about what Victor had told her in the cafe. People with long memories and longer grudges. She thought about enemies. She thought about a world where the surface of things was all that mattered, and what happened when someone tried to use the surface to destroy you. "I need to talk to him," she said. She called him from the courtyard. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "I've seen them," he said immediately. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it she hadn't heard before, a tautness, a contained anger. "De Luca says the university will review," Elena said. "Yes. I've already spoken to the dean. I'm stepping back from the seminar, effective immediately." A pause. "Elena, I am sorry. This is—" "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize for something you didn't cause." "Well, I caused the situation that made this possible. We both did." She was quiet for a moment, watching the pigeons in the courtyard. "De Luca thinks this was coordinated, that someone went to trouble." Silence. A long one. "Yes," he said finally. "I think so too." "Who?" Another pause. She could feel him making the same calculation she had seen him make in the cafe. How much to give her, how much to protect her from, where those two things were in conflict. Victor, she said, I told you I want to vote. A breath. There is a man, Ricci. He and I had significant business interests that dissolved badly about 8 years ago. He has held that against me since. He has made moves before, nothing I couldn't manage. But he has more reason now to be motivated. Why now? Because I am more exposed now than I was, he said. I'm in a public position. My name is attached to an institution. That gives him better leverage than when I was operating privately. A pause that had weight to it. And because I think he has become aware of you, and you are the most effective thing he could use against me. The implication was cold and specific. Ricci wasn't just attacking Victor's professional reputation. He was attacking through Elena, using her as the instrument. Is he dangerous? She asked. Potentially. I have people looking into how far this has gone. People, she said, as in people who are good at understanding when a situation is escalating and how to manage it before it becomes something worse. A brief pause. I am not without resources, Elena. I have not been careless. I know, she said. I know you haven't. She thought for a moment. What do you need from me? To be careful, he said. Not to be frightened, but to be aware. Don't go anywhere you would normally be alone at unusual hours. Tell me if anything feels wrong. That's it? What else would I ask you to do? I don't know. Disappear, maybe. Tell you it's too complicated. Tell you it isn't worth this. A pause. Is that what you want to tell me? She looked up at the gray February sky, at the old limestone walls of the university buildings, at the ordinary Tuesday morning continuing around her with its complete indifference to the fact that everything was complicated. No, she said, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Elena, I know, she said. Me too. The university scandal moved at the speed that institutional scandals always move, faster than anyone expects and in more directions than anyone tracks. By Wednesday, the story had been picked up by 2 local news outlets who ran it in the tone they reserved for anything involving sex and prestige and age gaps. A tone of performative concern that was actually prurient fascination wearing a responsible face. Elena's social media accounts were suddenly very busy with people who had not previously been interested in her existence. She turned off her notifications and went to the archive and worked on her thesis and came home and cooked dinner and did not watch the news and had a long, quietly devastating phone call with her mother that ended with her mother saying, Elena, I don't understand you. I have never understood you. Which was perhaps the most honest thing her mother had said to her in years. Her father called the next day. He was a quieter man than her mother, a retired engineer from Brescia who had always had more patience with his younger daughter's complications than her mother did. He said, tell me what's true, and then tell me how you're doing, in that order. She told him both. He listened without interrupting. This man, her father said when she finished. Do you trust him? She thought about it seriously, giving the question the weight it deserved. Yes, she said. I know how it looks from outside. But yes, I trust him. Then I'll trust your judgment, her father said. I won't pretend it doesn't worry me, but I'll trust your judgment. She cried after she hung up, properly, for about 10 minutes, the kind of crying that was relief as much as grief. Then she washed her face and went back to her desk. On Friday, Adrian came to her apartment. She heard the knock and looked through the peephole and stood for a moment with her hand on the door handle, making a decision. Then she opened it. He looked worse than she expected. Not physically diminished, Adrian was constitutionally incapable of looking actually bad, but frayed in a way she hadn't seen before. Sleepless, maybe. Or simply confronted with things he would have preferred to remain unconsidered. Can I come in? He asked. No, she said. She kept her voice even. What do you want, Adrian? He stared at her. What do I want? A disbelieving laugh, the sound of someone who is prepared for a different conversation. Elena, you're in the news. You're photographed with my father. I want to understand. You don't have the right to understand anything about my life, she said. You forfeited that in your father's guest room in October. That's fair, he said, and she was surprised enough by the concession that she looked at him more carefully. He ran a hand through his hair, You're right. That's fair. He stopped, reorganized. He's 50 years old. I'm aware. He's my father. I'm aware of that too. Does none of that, he struggled visibly. Elena, does none of that matter to you? She held his gaze, thought carefully about what she wanted to say, not what would hurt him, not what would protect herself, but what was actually true. It matters, she said. Of course it matters. These are real complications, and I'm not pretending otherwise. A pause. But you don't get to make this about your feelings, Adrian. You genuinely don't. He was quiet. Something moved across his face, not a comfortable thing, but perhaps an honest one. Is he good to you? He asked, finally, quietly. She looked at her former boyfriend, at the man who had failed her in the most specific way, standing in her doorway, asking, beneath the mess of his own ego and hurt, what might have been the only question that actually mattered. Yes, she said. He is. Adrian nodded. He looked like a man who wanted to say something else and was, possibly for the first time in his life, choosing not to. Okay, he said. He left. She closed the door and leaned against it and breathed. Warm. Victor came to her apartment that evening. He knocked, and she opened the door, and he stood in the hallway looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, open and almost uncertain, the composure not gone but held more loosely, as though he had decided to stop using it as armor. I should have managed this better, he said. The exposure. I should have been more careful about protecting you from Victor. She stepped back from the door. Come in. He came in. He looked around the small studio with its art books stacked into furniture and the Modigliani print above the desk and the thesis notes spread across the kitchen table, and something in his expression softened in the way of someone seeing a place that tells them something essential about a person. Adrian came today, she said. His eyes sharpened. What did he want? To object, mostly, and then eventually, she paused. He asked if you were good to me. Victor was quiet. I told him yes, she said. He looked at her across the small room with her thesis notes and her Modigliani print and the winter evening pressing against the windows. She watched him decide something. She could see it, the deliberate unlocking of something he had held under careful management for 4 months. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and she met him in the middle, and his hands framed her face with a gentleness that was incongruous and exactly right. This large, complicated, half-dangerous man holding her face like something rare. He kissed her with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has been thinking about this for a very long time. She kissed him back with the relief of someone who has been pretending not to want something and has finally, simply, stopped pretending. When they separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. He stayed close, his forehead against hers, both of them breathing in the quiet. There are people who are going to make this very difficult, he said against her hair. I know. The university review, the press, Ricci and whatever he's planning. I know all of that. You should be allowed to have a life that isn't complicated by my history. Victor. She pulled back enough to look at him. His gray eyes, close now, were the most complicated thing she had ever tried to read. Stop building the case against yourself. I've made my argument. You don't get to overrule the jury. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, that ancestor of a smile, the one she had been watching develop since October, arrived fully on his face. It changed him entirely. He was handsome without it. With it, he was something more human and far more devastating. You are extraordinary, he said. The same word he had used in the cafe, talking about Lucia. Placed here, now, with intention. I know, she said. You're not bad yourself for a man who claims to be uncertain about things. I'm not uncertain about this, he said. Good, she said. Neither am I. Outside, Milan moved through its February dark, the canals black and still, the street lamps haloed with cold, the ancient city carrying its centuries of complicated stories with the patient endurance of something that has outlasted every scandal, every love, every carefully constructed life that came apart and rebuilt itself into something different. In Elena's small apartment, with the thesis notes on the kitchen table and the Modigliani watching from the wall, Something that had been forming since October finally settled into its true shape. It was not simple. It was not safe. Every problem Victor had named was real, and there were more he hadn't named. And tomorrow the university would continue its review, and Ricci would continue his campaign, and the world would continue having opinions about things it didn't fully understand. But it was true, and in the accounting of things, that counted for a very great deal. The university review lasted 11 days. Elena knew this because she counted them. Not obsessively, not with dread exactly, but with the particular awareness of someone waiting for a verdict they cannot control and have decided not to spend energy fearing. She went to the archive every morning. She worked on her thesis. She ate dinner with Victor 3 times that week, in his apartment across the city, a place that suited him completely, spare and high-ceilinged with books on every wall and the kind of furniture that had been chosen for use rather than appearance, and a kitchen where he cooked with the focused competence he brought to everything, and where she sat on the counter and talked to him while he worked and felt, with increasing steadiness, that this was what a life was supposed to feel like. The review board summoned Victor on the 8th day and Elena on the 9th. Her session lasted 40 minutes. 3 faculty members and a university administrator in a room that smelled of institutional carpet and careful neutrality. They asked their questions with the professional politeness of people doing something they found somewhat distasteful. She answered honestly about the timeline, about the nature of their interactions, about the fact that nothing of an inappropriate nature had occurred while he was her professor of record. She was precise. She was clear. She did not apologize for anything she did not owe an apology for. The administrator, a woman in her 50s named Ferrara, who had the eyes of someone who had conducted many such reviews and been surprised by very few of them, looked at her for a long moment after her final answer. "You understand," Ferrara said, "that the perception of favoritism in academic evaluation, regardless of what has or hasn't technically occurred." "I understand perception," Elena said. "I also understand that Professor Valenti did not grade a single piece of my work during the semester. He recused himself from my evaluation the week the seminar began. You'll find that in the records." She paused. "I would also note that my thesis, which was developed entirely independently and is supervised by Professor Di Luca, has been described by 3 external readers as some of the strongest original scholarship in this program in the past 5 years. I would prefer that my work be assessed on its merits." Ferrara looked at her for another moment. Then she made a note. On the 11th day, the review board issued its finding. No policy violation had occurred. Victor was cleared to resume teaching in the following semester, should he choose to, with the recommendation that he not be assigned to supervise any student with whom he had a personal relationship, a recommendation so obvious it barely needed stating. The university issued a brief public statement. The press denied the scandal they had been cultivating, moved on to other things with the attention span of people who were never really interested in the truth. Victor called her when the decision came through. He said, "It's done." And she said, "I know, Di Luca told me." And there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable but full. The silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are taking a moment to acknowledge it without turning it into a speech. "Come to dinner," he said. "I'll cook." "You always cook," she said. "You always eat it," he said. "We've established a functional arrangement." She laughed and said she'd be there at 7 and hung up and stood in the archive for a moment with her hand still on her phone, letting herself feel, plainly and without qualification, relieved. But Ricci did not move on. Victor told her about it on a Thursday evening in March, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner between them and the kind of directness that she had come to recognize as one of his primary modes of respect. He did not minimize. He did not perform confidence he didn't have. He said, "Ricci has made contact with 2 of my current business associates. He's attempting to destabilize my legitimate operations." Lena set down her wine glass. "How serious is that?" "Serious enough to require attention, not serious enough to be dangerous in itself. He can apply pressure, but my legal businesses are structured to withstand it." A pause. "The concern is what it indicates about his intentions. He's escalating." "Why now?" she asked, and then, because she already knew part of the answer, "Because of me." Victor held her gaze. "Because of us," he said. "Yes. He's identified that you are significant to me. He's testing whether threatening what I care about will produce a different response than threatening my business interests. The word significant landed with its full weight. She didn't deflect it. What does he want? She asked. Ultimately, what's the endgame? Leverage. Specifically, he wants me to facilitate access to a shipping infrastructure that my family built 20 years ago. I have been very deliberately dismantling it. He wants it operational again. Victor's voice was flat and factual, the voice of someone describing something objectively terrible with complete composure. I will not do that, under any circumstances. So his threats are going to escalate until he determines that they won't work, Elena said. Yes. And in the interim, you need to be careful, he said. I have people watching. There are measures in place, but I want you to know what we're dealing with. Not because I want you to be afraid, but because I asked for a vote, she said. Because you asked for a vote, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, March was doing what March did in Milan, raining with a cold, determined persistence, the canal water rising slightly, the city gray and beautiful under low clouds. I want to learn to defend myself, she said. Victor looked at her. Not because I'm panicking, she said, because I'm practical. If there's a situation where your people aren't immediately accessible and I need to handle something myself, I would like to be capable of handling it. I don't want to be a liability. He studied her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the instinct to protect against the recognition that she was right, that the most protective thing he could do was not to shield her but to equip her. I know someone, he said finally. She runs a self-defense program, former military. She's worked with people in situations like ours before. Then call her, Elena said. He nodded slowly. You continue to surprise me, he said. Good, she said. Complacency is bad for the relationship. The corner of his mouth moved. Is that what we're calling it? The relationship? She met his eyes. What would you call it? A pause. Something moved in his face. Not a complicated thing for once, just direct. The most important thing that's happened to me in 20 years, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand palm up and held hers with the careful steadiness that was his version of tenderness. Not effusive, not performed, just completely certain. Then we protect it, she said. Together. Not you protecting me. Together. He looked at her hand in his. Together, he agreed. The self-defense training began the following week. Her name was Sergeant Benedetta Farrow, retired, as Victor had said, from a branch of the military that she described only as specialized, in the tone of someone who has signed things that prevent specificity. She was 43, compact and unhurried in her movements with the efficiency of someone for whom physical competence was simply a fact of life. And she looked at Elena on the first morning with an assessment that was entirely professional and not particularly warm. What's your baseline? Jacob Farrow asked. I can run 5 kilometers without stopping, Elena said. I took a self-defense class in university 2 years ago. I remember approximately 15% of it. That's honest, Farrow said. I prefer honest to impressive. She handed Elena a bottle of water. We'll work 3 mornings a week. The goal is not to teach you to fight. The goal is to teach you to think, to read a situation, identify the exits, make decisions under pressure. Fighting is the last resort. Thinking is the first. They worked in a clean, bare studio that smelled of rubber matting and effort. Farrow was methodical and precise and occasionally very funny in a completely deadpan way that Elena discovered only when she laughed at something, and Farrow's expression confirmed that, yes, it had been intentional. She was also, without any ceremony about it, effective. Within 3 weeks, Elena could break a wrist grip 6 different ways and could move through a space she hadn't been in before and identify the 3 most critical vulnerabilities in under 30 seconds. Within 6 weeks, she was running 5 kilometers in the morning before sessions and going to bed tired in the clean, particular way of someone who has used their body honestly. You're good at this, Farrow told her one morning in early April, after Elena had moved through a scenario exercise with more composure than either of them had expected. You don't panic. I panic internally, Elena said, breathing through the cool down. I've just learned to separate the internal event from the external response. Pharaoh looked at her with what Elena was beginning to identify as the Pharaoh equivalent of being impressed. That's a skill most people take years to develop. I've been in a complicated situation for 6 months, Elena said. It teaches you. She told Victor about her progress on their Thursday evenings. He listened carefully, asked specific questions, and had the discipline not to say anything that could be interpreted as suggesting she wasn't capable of it. A discipline she recognized and appreciated, because it would have been easy for him to slip into protectiveness, and he consistently chose respect instead. She was also watching him navigate something she hadn't fully seen before: the business of dismantling a life's infrastructure while building a new one simultaneously. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers. He met with financial advisors. He was, carefully and systematically, converting the last holdings of the old world into things that existed entirely in the light: real estate, an investment portfolio in legitimate technology, the early architecture of what he had begun calling the foundation. "What will it do?" she asked one evening, looking at the documents spread across his desk. Incorporation papers, a mission statement in draft form, proposals for programming. "Help people exit," he said. "People in the kinds of positions I was in, who want out but don't have a path. Legal assistance. Relocation. Skills training." He paused. "The criminal systems I operated in were not populated by people who had many alternatives. I knew that, and I benefited from it, and I did not think about it enough." He looked at the papers. "This doesn't correct that, but it's what I can do now." Elena looked at the mission statement. It was precise and unsentimental, the way he was. No redemption narrative, no self-congratulation, just a clear description of what the problem was and what resources would be brought to bear on it. "It's good," she said. "It's genuinely good, Victor." "Don't sound surprised," he said. "I'm not surprised, She stopped, looked at him. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Is that allowed?" He looked at her with an expression she had no single word for, something compounded of surprise and gratitude and the particular warmth of a person who has not been looked at that way in a very long time. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think that's allowed." Ricci made his first direct move on a Wednesday afternoon in April. Elena was walking back from the archive, taking the longer route along the canal because the afternoon was finally warm. The first genuinely warm day of spring, sunlight on the water, the city exhaling after winter. She had her bag over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, and she was thinking about the Modigliani chapter, which was finally coming together the way she had always believed it could. She noticed the car because Pharaoh had taught her to notice cars, specifically cars that appeared twice in different contexts, which was the primary indicator of deliberate surveillance. A gray sedan. She had seen it parked outside the archive when she arrived. Now it was moving slowly along the canal road, parallel to her path, approximately 50 meters back. She did not change her pace. She did not look directly at the car. She took out her phone and called Victor's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Gray sedan," she said quietly. "Canal Road, following at distance. I first saw it parked outside the archive this morning. It's been following me for approximately 4 minutes. A half-second of silence. "Where exactly on the Canal Road?" She told him. "Keep walking at your normal pace. Don't turn around. There's a cafe on your left in about 200 meters. The one with the blue awning. Go in, order something, sit where you can see the door." His voice was completely calm. "My people are 12 minutes away." "I'm not frightened," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. She was very alert. She was operating with the particular sharpened clarity that Pharaoh had been teaching her to access under pressure, but she was not frightened. Fear and clarity were different things, and she had learned to choose between them. "I know you're not," he said. "You're doing exactly right. Keep the line open." She kept walking, found the cafe with the blue awning, went in, ordered a coffee, chose a table by the window with a clear sight line to the door, and sat down with her bag on the chair beside her and her phone in her hand and watched the door with the calm attention of someone who had been trained to assess rather than react. The gray sedan passed the cafe without stopping. She reported this. "They're establishing your route," Victor said. "Not ready to make a move. This is reconnaissance." "That's what I thought," she said. A brief pause. "You analyzed it correctly." "Pharaoh is an excellent teacher," Elena said. Victor's people arrived in 9 minutes. Two men she had met before, quiet and competent, and with the particular economy of movement that indicated professional training. They came in separately, ordered coffee, and positioned themselves without any observable choreography that would suggest coordination. She recognized them and looked back at her phone and felt something that wasn't quite adrenaline but was adjacent to it. The peculiar aliveness of a situation that required her to be entirely present. Victor arrived 20 minutes later. He came in the front door and crossed to her table and sat down across from her, and the relief on his face was the first time she had seen him fail to contain an emotion immediately. "You're all right," he said. "I'm completely fine," she said. "I did everything correctly." He looked at her across the table with the cafe noises around them and the spring afternoon through the window, and something in his gray eyes was very unguarded. "You did," he said. "You did everything correctly." "Don't be surprised," she said, echoing him, and he laughed, a short, real laugh, surprised out of him. The laugh of a man who had been holding his composure under significant pressure and had it briefly broken by a 23-year-old woman with espresso and perfect situational awareness. "Ricci is accelerating," he said, when the laugh had settled. "This was a message. He's telling me he can reach you." "Then we send him a message back," Elena said. "What kind of message?" "That reaching me accomplishes nothing, that I'm not leverage, that whatever he's trying to move in you by threatening me—" She paused. "It won't move." Victor looked at her steadily. "Elena, he's a dangerous man. I know that. If he determines that surveillance and pressure aren't working, he may escalate to—" "I know what escalation means," she said. "Victor, I am asking you, directly, not to make this decision for me. I understand the risk. I'm telling you that I'm choosing to stay in it with you. That's my decision to make." The silence between them had the weight of something significant. "Why?" he asked, and the word was stripped of everything except genuine need to understand. She looked at him. In the afternoon light, in the ordinary warmth of a Milan cafe, with the canal outside and the spring air and the unresolved danger and the whole complicated reality of what they were to each other. "Because you spent 20 years being someone you didn't admire," she said, "and you changed. You chose something harder and more true, and you're still choosing it every day. And the man who does that—" She stopped. "Let the sentence be what it was. That's who I want to stand next to, whatever that costs." Victor Valenti, who had operated in rooms where weakness was currency and composure was armor, who had spent 30 years cultivating the ability to feel things without showing them, looked at the 23-year-old woman across the cafe table and was, simply and completely, undone. Not collapsed. That was not his nature and never would be. But the careful architecture of his self-containment, the thing he had built and maintained through a great deal of loss, was visibly not sufficient for this moment. Something came through it, raw and certain and not for management. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Elena," he said. "I know," she said. He held her hand in the cafe and looked out at the canal for a long moment. "Ricci has a weakness," he said finally. His voice was back, controlled, precise. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, or had been there and was now simply not being hidden. "He has operated under the assumption that I would protect what I care about by pulling it away from him, by creating distance between myself and the things that matter to protect them." "But that's not what you're going to do," Elena said. "No," he said. "I'm going to make it very clear that what I care about is not a weakness. It's a source of strength. And I'm going to do that by—" He paused. "By not hiding." She looked at him. "What does that mean specifically?" "It means that I am done allowing this relationship to be framed as something that needs to be managed or concealed. It means that I am going to be, publicly and without apology, the man who is with you." He held her gaze. "Which will remove it as leverage. You cannot threaten someone with the exposure of something they've already exposed." "That's tactically sound," she said. "It's also true," he said. "Which matters more." She turned her hand in his so that she was holding him back. "The press will have opinions." "The press always has opinions. Most of them are boring. My mother will have opinions." "I'll talk to your mother." She looked at him. "You want to talk to my mother?" "I want to do this correctly," he said. "I want—" He stopped, looked at their hands. I am 50 years old and I have been in situations of considerable complexity, and I have not been frightened of very many things. But this, he gestured between them, a small, uncharacteristic gesture, slightly helpless. I don't want to do this wrong. I don't want to be another thing in your life that turns out to be less than it appeared. The vulnerability in it was enormous. From this man, it was enormous. You're not, she said, clearly, without qualification. You are exactly what you appear to be. That's actually the remarkable thing. You are exactly, entirely yourself. He looked at her for a long time. I want to give you something, he said. Not now, not today, when this is resolved, when Ricci is no longer a variable and the foundation is established and the last of the old world is properly put to rest. He stopped, his gray eyes very direct. I want to give you the life you should have, the full version. I'm asking you to wait for it. She understood what he was saying. Not a proposal, not yet. Too much still unresolved, but a promise. The architecture of a future offered with both hands. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He nodded once, turned back to the canal. Then let's finish this, he said. Finishing it took 6 more weeks and was not a clean or comfortable process. Victor moved against Ricci the way he moved against most things, systematically, without announcement, using every resource available with the efficiency of someone who understood that drawn-out conflicts benefited the person with fewer things to lose. His legal team filed injunctions that froze 3 of Ricci's key financial instruments. His contacts, the legitimate ones, which were more numerous than Elena had initially understood, applied pressure through channels that were entirely above board and entirely effective. And the information his people had gathered about Ricci's own business practices, carefully documented and delivered to the appropriate authorities, triggered an investigation that had the specific gravitational force of institutions moving against someone who had spent years assuming he was too well connected to be investigated. Elena watched this happen from the position she had claimed, beside him, informed, not sheltered from the reality, but not required to carry more of it than was hers to carry. Pharaoh continued their sessions. She continued her thesis. She had dinner with her father in Brescia, a long Sunday afternoon where Victor came with her, sitting across from her father in the small, warm house where Elena had grown up, talking about the foundation with the directness that her father respected and the self-awareness that made honesty something more than confession. Her father had shaken Victor's hand at the end of the evening and said, "You know she's the sharpest person I've ever met." "Yes," Victor said. "I know." "Don't waste that," her father said. "I don't intend to," Victor said. Her mother was harder. She came to Milan in April and sat across from them in a restaurant with the expression of a woman who had prepared for a battle and was slightly disoriented to find that the enemy was not performing hostility. She interrogated Victor with the specific thoroughness of a mother who has decided that thoroughness is the last line of defense, and he answered everything, the age gap, the history, the enemies, the former life, with a precision and patience that was more disarming than any charm could have been. By the end of the meal, her mother had not capitulated, exactly, but something had shifted in her. The expression of someone who has encountered a thing that doesn't fit their existing framework and has decided reluctantly that the framework may require revision. She called Elena the following week and said, "He's very direct." "Yes," Elena said. "Your father likes him." "I know." A pause. "He looks at you like you're the Modigliani," her mother said. Elena stopped. "What?" "You know, like you're the painting, like he's been eating dinner with you every night for years and is still not finished understanding you." A short silence. "I don't know what to do with him, but I recognize that." Elena sat with her phone in her hand and felt something warm and unexpected move through her. "Thank you, Mama," she said. Her mother made the sound she made when she was feeling something she hadn't planned to feel. "Be careful," she said. "That's all I'll say. Be careful and be happy." In that order. Ricci's investigation accelerated in May. By the end of the month, his assets were frozen, and he was the subject of a formal criminal inquiry that had nothing to do with Victor directly and everything to do with his own accumulated history, which, when examined by people with the proper authority and motivation to examine it, turned out to be extensive and poorly concealed. Victor told Elena on a Tuesday evening, standing in the kitchen of his apartment in the unhurried way he had when something significant had resolved. "It's done," he said. "Not completely. The legal process will run its course. But he's neutralized. He no longer has the freedom of movement to make anyone a target." Elena set down the book she was reading. "How do you feel?" He considered the question seriously, which was one of the things she loved about him. He never answered a real question with a reflexive answer. "Relieved," he said, "and lighter. There's a kind of weight that you carry for so long you stop noticing it's there. And then it's gone, and you notice the absence." She stood up and crossed the room to him. He opened his arms and she walked into them, and they stood together in the kitchen with the May evening coming through the windows, warm and golden, the city doing what it had always done and would always do, entirely indifferent and perfectly beautiful. "What now?" she asked against his shoulder. "Now," he said, "we build." She felt his arms tighten around her slightly. Outside, somewhere on the canal, a boat moved through the water with a low, steady sound. The Modigliani print she had given him, a small reproduction of the painting from the estate, a gift she'd found at the archive's gift shop and presented with deliberate casualness, hung on the wall of his study where she could see it from where they stood. The elongated figure in ochre and rose, looking sideways out of the frame with the expression of someone who knows something private and essential and will not be reduced to anything simpler. "They do not paint what they look like," Modigliani had written in March 1907, unable to sleep. "They paint what they feel like from the inside." She understood that now, in her bones, in the specific way you understand things that have been demonstrated rather than explained. The knowledge of what something felt like from the inside rather than how it appeared, that was the thing that changed you. That was the thing you could not unfeel once you had learned it. Victor pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Stay tonight," he said. She tilted her head back to look at him, his gray eyes close and clear and entirely without management. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was the same sentence she had said in the cafe, after the canal road and the gray sedan and the afternoon that had clarified everything. She said it now because it was still true, and because some things needed to be said more than once to establish that they were not circumstantial, that they were not true only in crisis, but true in ordinary evenings, in kitchens, in the long and unremarkable continuity of a life lived alongside someone. He understood that. She could see him understand it. "Good," he said simply. The May evening settled around them, warm in particular, full of the specific quality of light that Milan produced in late spring, amber and golden and slightly dreamlike, the kind of light that made even familiar things look like they were being seen for the first time. Neither of them moved. There was no urgency anymore. The urgency had been the pressure of Ricci, of the review board, of the scandal and the surveillance and the accumulated weight of everything that had been working against them. Now the pressure was gone, and what remained was simply what had always been there underneath it. Two people, in a kitchen, at the end of a complicated road, with everything still ahead of them. She thought about the night in October when she had collapsed in a private study she shouldn't have entered, and how everything that mattered had begun in exactly the wrong place, in exactly the wrong way, from exactly the kind of wreckage that didn't look like a beginning. She thought about Modigliani in Paris in 1907, standing in front of masks that showed him what a face could do when it stopped being what it looked like and became what it felt like from the inside. She thought about 30-year-old scotch and an untouched whiskey glass, and a man who had bought a painting he didn't understand and eaten dinner with it every night for a decade. Some things, she thought, take exactly as long as they take, and then they become what they always were. She turned back to her book. Victor started cooking. The apartment held them both in the easy quiet of two people who have stopped pretending and started simply being, which is the hardest and most necessary thing, and also, when you finally arrive at it, the most natural thing in the world. Summer arrived in Milan the way it always did, without apology, replacing the gentle gold of spring with something more insistent, the city heating from the stones up, the canals going still and bright, tourists filling the piazzas and the restaurants spilling their tables out onto every available surface of pavement. Elena finished her thesis on a Tuesday morning in late June. She typed the final sentence of the final chapter, a conclusion about Modigliani's legacy that circled back to the letter she had found in the archive, The young painter who couldn't sleep, who had looked at masks and understood something essential about what a face was for. And then she sat very still in front of her laptop in the apartment she still kept in the Navigli. Though she spent more nights now at Victor's than at her own place, and she let herself feel the completion of it. Not triumphant, not exactly. More like the feeling of setting down something heavy you've been carrying for a long time. The relief and the slight disorientation of suddenly having your hands free. She sent it to DeLuca with a message that said only, "It's done." DeLuca responded within 4 minutes, about time. "It's excellent and you know it. Come to my office Thursday." Then Elena called Victor. "It's finished," she said when he picked up. A brief pause. "All of it?" "All of it. Every chapter, every footnote, the bibliography, which is 47 pages long because I have a problem." She heard something in his voice that she had learned over the past months to identify as his version of joy. Not effusive, never that, but a particular quality of attention, a warmth that came through the careful architecture of his composure like light through a well-made door. "I'll make dinner," he said. "Victor, you always make dinner." "Tonight I'll make it better," she laughed. "That's a high bar." "I'm aware," he said. "I'll see you at 7. She sat for another moment after hanging up, looking at the closed laptop, at the thesis that represented 2 years of her life, and the most important intellectual argument she had made yet, and the archive letter, and the fang masks, and the long, elongated faces that felt like something from the inside. Then she stood up, put on her coat despite the June warmth because she had never fully trusted Milan's weather, and went outside. The canal was doing what it did in summer, bright and slightly too still, smelling of water and warm stone. She walked along it for a long time without any particular destination, the way she had learned to walk when she needed to let her thoughts settle from the agitation of completion into something quieter. She passed the cafe with the blue awning where Victor's people had come for her in April and felt the memory of that afternoon. The way you feel old injuries in certain weather, not with pain, but with a clear awareness that it had happened and that she had not broken. She thought about everything that had happened since October. The party, the bedroom door, the study, the man at the lectern, the library Thursdays, and the careful management and the December evening when they had finally said the true thing to each other. The photographs, the review board, the gray sedan on the canal road, her father's handshake, her mother's voice saying he looks at you like you're the Modigliani, Pharaoh teaching her to read exits and make decisions under pressure. The May evening in the kitchen when the urgency had finally, fully dissolved. 8 months. In 8 months, she had gone from believing she was invisible to understanding that invisibility had never been the truth of her. It had only been the limited vision of people who were not paying enough attention. She stopped at a bench along the canal and sat in the June warmth and looked at the water and felt, with a clarity that was relatively new and very welcome, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was simple, not because the complications had vanished, but because she had chosen it with full knowledge of what it cost. And the choosing was the thing. The conscious, deliberate, eyes-open choosing was what made it hers in a way that nothing accidental or comfortable could have been. She took out her phone and looked at it for a moment. Then she called Marta. The phone rang 4 times. She had expected voicemail. Instead, her sister picked up. "Elena." Marta's voice was careful. The voice of someone who has been waiting for a call they weren't sure would come, and now that it has, doesn't know what to do with it. "I finished my thesis today," Elena said. A short silence. "That's... congratulations. Really. Thank you." Elena watched a swan move through the canal water with its preposterous, magnificent indifference to everything. "I've been thinking about calling you for a while." "I know. I've been..." Marta stopped, started again. "I've been trying to figure out what to say. I've written about 20 texts and deleted them all because everything I write sounds either like an excuse or like I'm making it about me." "It mostly was about you," Elena said, not unkindly. "I know that." A long pause. "Elena, I don't have a defense. I don't have an explanation that makes it okay. I was stupid and selfish and I'm sorry. I'm genuinely, actually sorry. Not for getting caught, for doing it." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 8 months, about what forgiveness cost, and what it gave back. I know, she said. I believe you. You do? You're many things, Marta. Stupid and selfish sometimes, yes, but not a liar. When you're actually sorry, you sound actually sorry. A silence that contained something. Relief, maybe, or the particular exhale of someone who has been holding a weight and has just been allowed to set it down. How are you? Marta asked. I've seen the news, She paused. He's the best person I've ever known, Elena said simply. I know how that sounds. I know every objection to it. I've made all those objections myself, and I've thought through them carefully, and the conclusion is still the same. Okay, Marta said, in the tone of someone who is choosing to believe something not because all their doubts have been resolved, but because the alternative is to keep doubting, and that serves no one. Okay, Elena agreed. We should have coffee. When you're ready? I'm ready whenever you are. Good. I'll call you next week. A pause. Marta, it's not forgiven because it didn't matter. It's forgiven because I have too much ahead of me to keep carrying it. The call ended. Elena sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at the canal, and felt something in her chest that had been carrying a specific soreness since October finally release. The swan moved on. The summer afternoon continued. She put her phone in her pocket and walked home. Victor proposed in July. He did not do it with theatrical staging, no restaurant, no string quartet, no audience. This was, she reflected later, exactly correct and exactly him. He did it on a Sunday morning when they were in his study, her with her post-thesis reading spread across the ottoman, and him at his desk with the foundation's legal documents, the apartment quiet, with the particular Sunday morning quiet of two people who are comfortable enough in each other's presence to exist in the same space without filling it with sound. He stood up from his desk, came to the ottoman, sat down beside her without the preparation of a speech, without the ceremony of positioning, just sat down and looked at her with the gray eyes that she had been reading for 8 months and knew now as well as she knew anything. I have something, he said. She looked up from her book. He opened his hand. In his palm was a ring, not enormous, not theatrical. A single oval stone, deep blue-green, set in plain gold. Old, the kind of old that meant it had been in a family, that it had been on someone's hand before, and had a history outside of its current moment. It was my grandmother's, he said. She was a difficult woman who made excellent decisions about the things that actually mattered. I've kept it for a long time. I wasn't sure I would find a reason to use it. Elena looked at the ring, then at his face. Victor, I am not going to make a speech, he said. You know everything there is to know about me, the good and the bad, and the history, and the things I'm still working to correct. You've known all of it for months, and you've stayed anyway, not out of naivety, but with full understanding. And what I want to offer you, he stopped, chose the next words with the care he brought to everything that mattered. What I want to offer you is a future that's entirely in the light. No more history coming for us. No more management of old mistakes. Just what we build from here. Is there a question in this? She asked, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She could feel them wanting to shake and making a decision not to. Elena Rossi, he said, will you marry me? Not the inflection of uncertainty, the inflection of a man who knew what he was asking and why, and had decided to ask it without the performance of doubt he didn't feel. She looked at him for a long moment. In the Sunday morning light, with the foundation documents on his desk, and the Modigliani print on the wall, and the thesis she had finished 3 weeks ago, and the 8 months of choosing laid out behind them like a road. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger with the same steadiness with which he did everything, completely present, not hurrying it. The stone caught the morning light and held it. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. Your grandmother had good taste, she said. She would have liked you enormously, he said, and found you extremely challenging. High praise from both of you, I assume. The highest, he said. She leaned across the ottoman and kissed him, and he kissed her back the way he had kissed her in February in the small apartment, focused and unhurried and completely certain. And outside the summer city moved in its beautiful, indifferent way, and neither of them paid it any attention. They married in September, 10 months after a birthday party that had broken everything open. The ceremony was small by any standard that would have been applied to a Valenti event. 30 people, a civil registrar, the courtyard of a small hotel outside Milan that had fig trees in the garden and walls the color of old honey. Elena wore a dress she had found in a vintage shop in the Brera district, cream-colored silk that had been made in 1962 for someone who had excellent posture and a similar frame, and which required 2 hours of alterations and was, in the end, exactly right. Her father walked beside her into the courtyard. Not walked her down the aisle. There was no aisle, just a garden path between 30 chairs and the fig trees. He held her arm and said, quietly, "You look like yourself," which was the best thing he could have said. Victor stood at the end of the path in a dark suit, watching her come toward him, and he had the expression she had never fully seen on him before the Sunday morning with the ring. Unguarded and entirely present, the composed exterior simply not present because it was not required, because this was not a room where armor served any function. De Luca was there, wearing a hat that was more confident than most of the other attendees. Barrow was there, standing with the particular posture of someone who spent their life assessing rooms for threats and had decided this one was safe. Her father. Her mother, who had spent 3 months arguing with herself about this, and had arrived at a position Elena summarized internally as reluctant but sincere. Adrian was not there. He had sent a card, an actual card, handwritten, which Elena had not expected. It said, "I handled everything badly. I hope you're both well. I mean that." She had shown it to Victor, who had read it and said nothing for a moment and then said, "He's better than he usually manages to be." She thought that was probably the most generous and accurate thing that could be said. The registrar was a small woman with reading glasses and an excellent sense of when to be efficient and when to allow silence. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. They said the words they had agreed to say, not traditional vows, but things they had actually written in the week before, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and drafting and arguing gently about language in the way two people argue who are both very precise about words. Victor said, "I spent a long time believing that the world I had built was the only one available to me. You showed me, without trying to, that this was a failure of imagination on my part. I'm committing to you and to the life we're building with everything I have that's worth anything, which is more than I thought it was, before you." Elena said, "I was 23 years old, and I thought being invisible was the condition of my life, rather than the failure of other people's attention. You looked at me like I was the most present person in the room, and then you were right, because you were paying attention and that changed what was true. I'm choosing you because you made me more myself, not less. That's the only reason that lasts." The registrar said the words that made it legal. They signed the papers. Victor kissed her with the specificity and attention that was his particular form of expression, and the 30 people in the garden made the sounds that people make when they are genuinely glad of something. Her mother cried, which Elena had not expected, and then recovered immediately and pretended she hadn't, which Elena had expected completely. De Luca found her afterward by the fig trees with 2 glasses of Prosecco and said, "The thesis committee met last week," with the expression of someone delivering news they have been holding for maximum timing. Elena looked at her. "And?" "Passed with distinction," De Luca said. "Unanimous. Ferrara from the review board was on the committee, incidentally, and she voted first." A pause. She said the Modigliani argument was the strongest original contribution to the field she'd read in a decade. Elena stood in the September garden with the Prosecco in her hand and the ring on her finger and the fig trees overhead, and felt something so complete and specific she didn't have a word for it. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. More like the feeling of arriving somewhere you have been moving toward without knowing it. The recognition of a destination you hadn't been given the name of in advance. She thought of the study in October, the private room she had entered by accident and collapsed in, and the man who had found her there and given her whiskey and told her she wasn't invisible, and said something about the Modigliani that turned out to be the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She thought of all the things that had had to break to make room for this. Victor appeared beside her, a glass of water in his hand. He drank rarely, and tonight he had said he wanted to remember everything clearly, and stood close enough that his arm was against hers, looking out at the garden and the 30 people, and the late September light that was doing what late September light did in northern Italy, golden and precise, and tending towards something that felt like meaning. "How do you feel?" he asked. She had asked him that before, in the kitchen in May, after Ricci. He had answered honestly then, and she expected nothing less now. "Like myself," she said. "Entirely like myself." He looked at her. The smile, the full one, the one that she had watched arrive slowly over the course of months, and which still had the power to change the whole structure of his face, was there. "Good," he said. She leaned into him, slightly, the way you lean into something solid that you have determined will hold. He put his arm around her. They stood together in the fig tree garden while the afternoon made its slow way toward evening, and the 30 people who had come to witness this talked and laughed, and someone found the Prosecco, and someone else found the food, and all of it, was exactly and only what it was. The years that came after were not without difficulty. Nothing worth having is without difficulty, and Elena had long since stopped expecting otherwise. The foundation launched in October, a month after the wedding, which was timing Victor had planned deliberately, wanting the two things separate, each its own event rather than one overshadowing the other. The launch was covered by 3 newspapers and 1 magazine, not as a scandal or a curiosity, but as news. A significant financial commitment to criminal rehabilitation and exit programming, backed by Valenti money and a board that included 2 former prosecutors, a social psychologist whose work Elena had been reading for her own research, and in an advisory capacity, Benedetta Ferro. Victor ran it with the same precision he brought to everything. He was not a man who needed to be celebrated for it. He was somewhat allergic to the specific form of self-congratulation that philanthropy sometimes produced, but he was deeply, genuinely committed to it in a way that Elena recognized as the commitment of someone making a debt payment that they know will never fully clear, but that they intend to keep making anyway. She watched him at the launch event, talking to a young man who was part of the first cohort of the program. 24 years old, 2 years out of a situation that had been, by any accounting, more desperate than anything Victor had managed in his worst years. Victor was listening with the total attention she knew well, asking the 2 precise questions, hearing the answers without agenda. The young man left the conversation looking like someone who had been taken seriously for possibly the first time. She found Victor afterward by the drinks table and stood beside him. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Yes," Victor said. "He is." A pause. "We're taking 12 more applications next quarter. The legal team thinks we can scale the exit program to 4 cities within 2 years. Rome first," she said. "Why Rome first?" "Because Rome is where the density of exactly the kind of entrenched system you're trying to address is highest. And because I have a contact at La Sapienza who runs an employment integration program that would partner beautifully with what you're building." He looked at her. "When did you develop a contact at La Sapienza?" "While you were managing Ricci, I was making calls," she said. "I had to do something with the training Ferro gave me. Turns out situational awareness works in professional contexts too." He looked at her with the expression she had never had a single word for, the one that contained everything. Then he picked up both their glasses, handed her hers, and said, "Rome first," with the finality of someone making a decision that was already made. So, Elena's thesis was published the following spring, with a press associated with the university that De Luca had been negotiating with since December. The book, and it was a book now, expanded from the thesis with 2 additional chapters that the Modigliani archive letter had made possible, received the kind of attention that serious art historical work rarely received, which was to say more than she expected and less than it deserved, which De Luca told her was the standard condition of the field, and to be grateful for what she got. She got a great deal. Reviews in 4 major journals, 2 international, an invitation to present at a symposium in Paris, where she stood in front of 200 art historians and argued the African formalism thesis with the same focused confidence with which she had argued it across a library table to a man who bought paintings he didn't yet understand and sat with them until the understanding came. She got a position at the university, not in Victor's department, in her own, a junior research fellowship attached to a project on cross-cultural influence in early modernism that De Luca had been designing with Elena's skills specifically in mind for the better part of a year. She got students of her own, a seminar on Italian modernism that she taught with the particular style she had absorbed from watching an excellent teacher over the course of a semester. Not the performance of professing, but the real thing, the thinking alongside, the questions held open, the room invited to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it prematurely. She found, to her own satisfaction, that she was good at it. She found, to her greater satisfaction, that she loved it. Loved standing in front of a room full of people, at the beginning of understanding something and knowing she had tools to give them, that she was in possession of something transferable and true. She called De Luca after her first solo lecture and said, "I think I know what I'm for." De Luca said, "I know you do. I've known since you wouldn't let me frame you as a victim," which was, coming from De Luca, essentially a declaration of profound admiration. 3 years after the wedding, on an October evening that had the particular quality of October evenings in Milan, cool and golden and carrying the first serious intention of autumn, Elena and Victor went back to the estate. It was not a sentimental decision exactly. Victor had been in discussions with a foundation partner about using the estate's east wing for a program residential facility, and it made practical sense to walk the space together. That was the reason they gave each other, the practical reason, and it was a real reason. They went in through the main gate in the early evening, the gravel drive under their feet, the pale limestone lit from inside with the same warm gold that had spilled across the hedgerows on Adrian's birthday 3 years ago. The ivy on the eastern wall was thicker now. The fountains were still. The party was long gone, of course. The estate was quieter, used less for the social performance it had been designed for, and more for the actual purposes Victor had been redirecting it toward: meetings, work, occasional stays for foundation board members coming from other cities. Elena stood in the main courtyard and looked up at the building. "It looks smaller," she said. "It always looks smaller when you're not frightened," Victor said. She looked at him. "I wasn't frightened that night." "You were not entirely calm," he said, with the precision of a man who remembers things accurately and sees no benefit in softening the record. She laughed. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't entirely calm." They walked the east wing, which was indeed appropriate for what they needed. Large rooms, good light from the north-facing windows, accessible without going through the main private areas of the house. Victor took notes in the methodical shorthand she had long since learned to read, and she contributed practical observations about traffic flow and accessibility that she had absorbed from watching the foundation's operations. And it was work, genuinely, and also entirely something else. They ended up, by the particular gravity of the evening, in the study. It was the same room, the same leather chairs, the same walls of books, the fireplace, unlit on this October evening, the grate clean and cold, the desk with its functional disorder. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and Victor stood beside her, and they both looked at the room that had been the beginning of everything without either of them knowing it. "I came in here and fell apart," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you found me." "You were in my private study," he said, with the mild tone of someone who has long since converted a grievance into something else. "I didn't have much choice. You gave me whiskey and told me I wasn't invisible," she said. "You had a choice." He looked at the room. She watched his face in the early evening light from the window, the face she knew better now than any painting she had ever studied, every line of it, every register of expression, the landscape of a man who had come a long distance from the person who had stood in this room with an untouched whiskey glass and said careful, managed things to a crying young woman he didn't know. "I'm glad I found you," he said, simply, without decoration. She moved into the room, sat in the near of the 2 leather chairs, the one she had collapsed into 3 years ago, and looked at the fireplace and the empty grate and the room that smelled of books and old wood and the faint, particular smell of a place that has held a great deal of life. "Sit down," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Is that an order?" "From the woman who broke into your private study and started your life over," she said. "Yes." He sat. The other chair, across from her as he had been then, the 2 of them in the study in the evening light. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Tell me something true," he said, the same words she had said to him in the library. "Return now with the ease of 2 people who have established that this is the language they speak." She thought about it. about the thesis finished and the foundation growing, and the students in her seminar, and the ring that had been his grandmother's, and the fig tree garden, and the Prosecco, and Di Luca's hat, and the October evenings, and all of it. The whole complicated, unlikely, abundantly real accumulation of what had been built from wreckage. I wouldn't change any of it, she said. Not the night at the party, not what I saw, not the study, or the library, or the photographs, or Ricci, or any of it. She held his gaze. Because all of it was the path. And the path brought me here. And here is... She stopped, looked for the right word, and found it. Here is exactly enough. He looked at her across the small space of the study in the evening light, and she watched him receive that, watched it land in the specific way that true things land when they reach someone who has learned to recognize them. Here, he said, is considerably more than enough. She reached across the arm of her chair. He reached across the arm of his. Their hands met in the space between the two chairs, the same space that had been 3 years ago, both impossible and full of possibility, and was now simply theirs, ordinary and irreplaceable in exactly what it was. Outside, Milan moved through its October dark. The canals carried the autumn light. The city that had held their beginning and every complicated thing that followed continued in its ancient, beautiful, indifferent way, carrying its centuries without judgment, making room in its long story for every love that had ever been called impossible and proven, in the fullness of its living, otherwise. The study held them both in the quiet of an evening that was simply itself, not a beginning anymore, not a crisis, not a turning point, just an evening, theirs, which was